To go deeper into the performance consequences
Yeah.
because when female athletes might be looking slower on the field or not as fit or not as explosive and powerful, oftentimes the first thing the parent will say is, we need to hire a trainer. We need to do more training. She is not fit. And as a performance coach, I'm like, wait a minute. Do you really need me right now? Or could this be a Reds under eating problem? Because if it is, the last thing you want to do is add more training with a trainer and just be breaking down your muscles more and overusing. And that's what I really want to hammer home with parents on this. It is not always a she is slow issue. She needs a speed coach.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's really important to highlight, especially because you're basically adding like gas to the fire when you add things like that in, if this is a problem. And if it's not, I would actually say that that's also an area where we have to be particularly concerned that we are making up for that additional work that's being done with a strength coach, with a performance coach. If you're adding anything in, you're going to increase that exercise energy expenditure. So whether or not that athlete is under fueling, and maybe that's why we see that they're slowing down on the field, if they're adding that piece in, we want to make sure that we're making up for it nutritionally, because that could also add to a scenario for an athlete who might not have actually been in a state of low energy availability. Now they're adding an extra training session in, they don't know how to account for it. So I think as a performance coach, as a parent, those are some important things to point to, of like, let's make sure we're fueling before this session. Let's make sure we're fueling after the session, making sure that, especially with our younger athletes who are like, they're so busy, they're bouncing from school to practice to maybe another practice, or hanging out with friends or doing club activities or what have you, is making sure that they have like high energy dense foods, and ones that have like are packed, nutritionally packed, so that they're ready to go and they can bring them with them. Convenience foods, we shouldn't be so scared of convenience foods, especially for some of our young athletes who are so active that sometimes that's the only option. We need to make sure that they're replenishing those calories in some way, shape, or form. And so some of those convenience foods that you can always have in your bag, that you can have on hand if you need them in case of emergency. Um, I'm always a big fan of like, pack extra snacks, have snacks in the car when you're driving to and from things, or just making it fun for them too. I think as a parent, like, part of your like responsibility around food in your home is actually creating a positive food culture where you're not talking about like demonizing food or talking about food as good and bad. And I try to even steer clear of like healthy and unhealthy, because it has a similar tone where you're still kind of assigning morality or superiority amongst food groups or certain foods. And so if you can kind of help drive that in your own home, I think that can go a really long way for your athletes, and getting curious about like, if your female athlete starts to have a food preference, is that just like normal tastes? Like, oh yeah, sometimes I don't like to have carrots and hummus because it just doesn't sound good. Or is it because they're no longer having that type of food because they're assigning morality to it, or because their friend told them that they shouldn't, or they saw something online that called that food bad. Just being curious about like maybe why preferences around food are changing. Those can be really important things to help guide the female athlete. I think they sound small, but they can go a long way.
How much has influencer social media culture maybe contributed to this? Because there's a lot of young girls on TikTok, and we're actually recording this as TikTok might be banned in a few days, who knows? But you see a lot of what I eat in a day is from certain influencers where they have their little salad with some seeds in it and there's like no substance, and these girls think, "Oh, well, I should eat that." And it's like, "Well, she's not a high-level athlete. She maybe goes to Pilates class and calls it a day." Like
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
how much has that been influencing and just sort of like the body image and not feeling enough as a female athlete?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of components to consider here. And while social media does provide probably a greater reach of good information around nutrition, and there's more dietitians online sharing good information that maybe athletes didn't have access to before, it's also just increased the pool of information so much so that honestly, not just our adolescent athletes, our young adult athletes, my college students, like, we have assignments that's like, find something online and debunk it because there's so much out there that's just inaccurate, it's misinformed, it's misguided, and sometimes it can be appropriate and just not appropriate for you, and I think that that's where some athletes tend to struggle the most with social media is when a message isn't meant for them and it's more of like a general health consideration and it's not a consideration for an athlete who's training at the level that this athlete's training at for the number of hours that they're training at the intensity that they're training at. Like most Americans don't meet the physical activity guidelines. Our athletes exceed the physical activity guidelines for Americans in like 1 to 2 days, and that's meant for, like, the week for a regular adult. So, I I try to, like, get that across too of, like, even if it's accurate, doesn't mean that that is something for you. But then beyond that, I think that there is this general sense of body dissatisfaction, comparison, um, whether it's food or bodies happening online. And we honestly don't know enough, which is pretty scary in like the research side of things about the impact of it, both in the short and long term. But as far as body image dissatisfaction goes, we know that like just general people who spend more time online tend to be more dissatisfied with their bodies. We know that those like what I eat in a day videos, even if they don't come from a place of like harm, can be quite triggering and harmful for athletes and general people as well. Like you look at what somebody else is doing, you're comparing yourself. That's a measuring stick and it can be quite harmful. I also have seen some studies or articles come across my page that I don't know too much about, like the algorithm of things, but TikTok has like come under fire for like pushing eating disorder content to users who like follow or like look at that type of content. And you're just like, well, that's, I feel like the exact opposite thing that we should be doing. Like, if I was in control and I saw that people were like looking at this negative messaging, I'd be like, can we fire off some positive messages their way? Like, so I think that there's like a lot that we don't know that happens like beyond behind the scenes with social media that can be quite scary. I think monitoring that stuff can be really important. And I've started like challenging athletes or parents of athletes and myself and my friends like, can you unfollow somebody today? Like, who makes you feel bad about yourself? Why are you still following them? Can you mute them? Like now, you know, if you are worried about offending somebody, like, well, just mute them so they don't show up on your page. Like, why are we following people and engaging in a platform that makes us feel bad about ourselves? And it's not always making us feel bad about ourselves. So I don't want to I am young enough to be like, "Okay, I get it, it's fun and it's, like, allows you to connect," but how can we put guardrails in place so that we're using it in a safer way, if that's even possible? I think it is, um, but I think that there needs to be some set of standards, like, I try to limit my screen time on Instagram's, like, the primary app that I use. I've definitely started, like, in the past 3 years, like, unfollowing people where I'm just like, "Oh, that doesn't make me feel good about myself," and they're not telling me like, "Oh, you look X, Y, or Z way, or you're doing this wrong," and, like, it's not people outwardly making you feel bad about yourselves a lot of the times. Sometimes it's just the way that you download that information in your own brain that makes you leave scrolling on your phone feeling worse than when you went to pick up your phone in the